Okay, so we were talking about kitsch and camp. Camp is a little more to do with, and I don't really feel this is a very good example. Camp is to do with something that is kind of cheesy or ugly or over the top, and we like it anyway. Probably like wearing one of those crazy rainbow clown wigs or something like that, like doing that on purpose and doing it with a sense of irony. So I'm going to have you Google Tallulah Bankhead and also Gloria Swanson on camp. Um, that might give you a better sense of, I'm going to say Tallulah Bankhead's a better example. I believe she coined the term. But the idea that you're having a perverse, sophisticated appeal with something, I don't know if you remember the trucker hats. Everybody's wearing trucker hats to like dance clubs, and they're originally for and dirty, and they're kind of ugly looking originally for people using it for a specific function out, using a tractor or a truck. Okay, so Tim Hawkinson's Bear. This particular piece is made out of granite, and it's combining Stonehenge with the sort of softness of a teddy bear. This really is 370,000 pounds. If something were to go wrong and his arms would fall off, these kids would not be in a very safe place. Um, I wouldn't say it's exactly kitsch or camp, but it is playing with the idea of something cute and soft and playful in a very fine art material and a very permanent sort of sculpture. This piece has actually been moved, strangely enough, when you think about that, the weight and the difficulty of this. He's a very famous artist, really amazing person that lives in Pasadena, does a lot of amazing work. We have some other pieces in the book, I believe. But at any rate, that's the book's example of camp. I'm not going to quite agree with that in this case, but there you are. All right, so craft is one of the last things we're going to talk about. Craft in the Renaissance time, 1400 to 1600 AD, they decide that painting, sculpture, and architecture are the three fine arts, and that everything else is craft. So what happens is this list of media right here: ceramics, glass, jewelry, weaving, and woodworking, and weaving being loom, rug weaving, and also baskets. Um, those things are now craft. They are not fine art. They are utilitarian, meaning useful objects, objects that we walk on, or we use cups of ceramic, or jewelry is something we wear. So if it's functional, it is no longer fine art. Now that is, and our book does say this, it is culturally specific. In this particular case, in Turkey, because Turkey is on the far eastern edge of Western civilization, if you will. Current Western civilization is Western Europe, and it is Islamic for the most part. It does have some Christian people and various other people living there as well. But this is the height of style at this particular time in the 18th century, and Islam embraces all these beautiful patterns. In Islam, you don't show figures, religious figures, and so on. And so their mastery of patterns and floral designs and geometric as well, which we don't really see here, is really quite at a high level. But at any rate, it's still considered craft in our eyes. In their culture, it may be considered a fine art piece. Okay, we're gonna explore this a little bit further, but just so you know, it does vary from culture to culture. Okay, so we're going to look at artists in broader culture, and something like the pyramids that required more than one artist. We actually know that Imhotep, this complex here did have a master designer, and that we do know some of their names, and that's really amazing when you think that this is over 4,000 years old, and there's so much of Egypt that is recorded. It's quite an amazing culture when you think about it. And I highly encourage you. I'm gonna have some things set up so you can kind of Google Earth and look at some of these places, because I want you to have a real sense of these places. They exist, and they were made so long ago by human hands, and they're still there, and to connect with that. Okay, so back to our point is that the idea is there's all these skilled workers and laborers, and they're supervised by architects and so on. But some of these monumental pieces, of course, required many, many hands. So, trained artists, we think of Leonardo da Vinci as kind of the extreme of the training. He was an apprentice with Del Verrocchio. Sorry, I'm not sure on how to say that. And then in Africa, you would train as an apprentice with the wood carving. We looked at that Maboom piece, and many cultures have apprentices. We even still have that in the U.S. for welding and different things like that. So that's one way, and the apprentice system that it took place in the guilds in medieval Europe. In Persia, we have the Kitab Khana, and we're going to see examples of Mughal painting. We'll look at that later. The academies in Europe, that is really this just after medieval Europe. That's the Renaissance right there. And we, as a college and university, are I would say, those are our ancestors. We come from the academy. That's the way we teach classes in terms of art and art studio as well. We teach from the academy method, the idea that you're going to learn certain principles and craftsmanship and so on. Okay, so just to take a complete left turn here, we're going to look at some artists have no training. We just talked about this training, how important it is. Now we're throwing it out the window. James Hampton is one of many folk artists in the world, and especially in the U.S. We have some really interesting. They tend to be reclusive. So here it says that he worked in isolation down here, and that's very true. He worked on this for many, many years. It says from 1950 to 64, and this is basically cardboard wrapped in colored tinfoil. Do we have a close-up of it? No, we don't. So you'll see this in the book. This is a really wild thing, just out of his own imagination. Looks something cultural Asian, maybe. It's really hard to place because it's really just his own pieces made up, and this was found in a closet, and now it is after he died, and it was now put into the Smithsonian American Art Museum in DC. He just worked on sculpture in his evenings after his day job as a janitor. Okay, so making the art objects. Sometimes art objects are made by workshops, as we just looked at. In terms of architecture, that's be a particular one. Large-scale artworks are made that way too, even paintings. And Rubens here that we're looking at, he maintained a large workshop. This is a big piece. It's 7 feet by 6 feet high. It's large. And he was very popular and very important and very sought after. So he may have somebody who's just really good at doing these landscapes or clouds or something like that, or the horse's hair or the woman's hair or flesh or something like that, and he would have somebody just work on those things for him, and he'd come back and sort of touch it up. We don't know exactly in terms of Rubens what was done by him personally, what was supervised, that kind of thing, but that's very common. There's also collaborations. When we talk about printmaking, the artist painted something like this with regular paint. In this case, in Japan, it might have been an ink wash painting. To make it into a print, which was what we're looking at here, then the block carver and a paper maker to make the paper to go with this type of ink, and the printer all have to come together. So there's really different ways of working. It's not always just an artist alone in their studio. That's kind of the point here. Community art making is also important. This happens in a lot of ways. When we talked about murals a little bit, this is something that really went wild because originally this AIDS quilt was kind of the size of it would cover a twin bed. They were pretty small, like 3 by 6, maybe even smaller than that. But once you started to put them together, all these people who had died, they said, okay, well, we'll make it this big. But I think one of the things that happened with this that was really remarkable when this started to be made, nobody realized how many deaths had actually happened. So people who had a loved one made a quilt in a way to express something about that person's life, You see right here, like Bruce Looney down here at the bottom, you see the name on there. Sometimes there's something emblematic to do more closely with that person, some experience in their life or so on. Then they start to get sewn together in these panels. And now there are so many of these panels. This is on the mall in Washington, D.C., and that's a huge, miles long stretch of land. And the quilt covers a good chunk of that. Really impressive. And also very sad because this each one of these squares has to do with the death of a person. This is a person who's died, that's a person who's died, and so on. So the impact of this was really important culturally and visually because as this thing was unfurled on the mall in Washington in 1992, then the numbers had a visual component to show how many people had actually died of this disease and how serious it was and how loved these people were, as opposed to some of the people in politics were really demonizing folks with AIDS, and this was a big turning point. This still circulates and travels, and I believe it does not always, or no longer travels in one big section. You can get parts of it, and it is continued to be added to, as we know.